Hello and welcome back to Karma Stories. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today I have some stories for you from the Malicious Compliance subreddit. Before we start today, all of you on YouTube, make sure to drop a like down below on this video. It really does help us out in the YouTube algorithm. And with that out of the way, let's jump right in. This story comes to us from FML, it's SML. You want us to refer to you by your job title? Okay then. In a previous role, I came across the epitome of manglement. A young guy who'd been smarmy enough to work his way into a leadership role without ever having to actually do the job he was managing. Unsurprisingly, he was less than effective. To use his words, we were the skilled team that worked for him. He was in the management. There are a few stories I can share about this D, including one where he said I was too attractive to do my job, but that's for another time. This particular anecdote was when the previous leader left, and we ended up with him. Our new leader was quite particular about his role. He wasn't just a leader, he was a production leader. He was quite insistent we called him by his job title, to the extent that he moaned when we said, "Oh, the gaffer says XYZ. Nope, it must be the production leader says XYZ. Please respect his job, thanks." I assume this was his pretentious effort to seem important. Remember, I said he'd never worked the job before? He never quite understood the details of what he was asking, and you could see his eyes glaze over and his mind wander to KPIs and metrics whenever someone said, that won't work. We need to do ABC first before we throw this job onto the machines. For the most part, we just worked it out ourselves and did what we could, and explained what we couldn't. More glazing over, and thoughts of metrics and checkboxes followed. His general demeanor didn't really sit well with us, especially how he thought he was better than the grunts working the job. The one thing that sticks in my mind is that the previous boss, who had retired, used to say our team. The new guy said my team. Small difference, but it speaks volumes. So we decided to maliciously comply. You want to be called by your job title? Sure, we can do that. However, we abbreviate everything, including your job title, Production Leader Operations. That abbreviated to PLOPS, which abbreviated to PLOPS. I can't take credit for the nickname, but it spread super quick. The Malicious Compliance was embedded. Within 36 hours, every shift knew that we had to follow PLOP's orders. For non-English speakers, plop is an onomatopoeic way of describing the act of passing waste. Plops was obviously quite unhappy with his new nickname. Just imagine the most nasally voice ever saying, "I'm a production leader," to a group of guys, most of which had been in the trade since before Plops was born. And you've got a good idea of how well-respected Plops ended up being. For the rest of his short career in that role, we called him Plops. It infuriated him. To give you an example of a typical incident, 3 of the shop floor guys are stood in the middle of the factory talking. Plop sees this and walks over to chastise them for not working. "Excuse me, gents." "What's up, Plops?" "I'm a production leader. Why aren't you on your machines?" "We're trying to figure out how to do the job." "What? Aren't you trained for this?" "We are, Plops. We've been doing it for 24 years. But the problem is, Plops, we have 4 sets of tooling available. Each job requires 2 sets of tools per machine. And as there are 3 of us, we would need, pause sarcastically to count, 6 sets of tools." "Nobody told me that." "Yes, because we normally split the job out by individual tasks. Number 1 can process the tasks that don't need tooling, then split the tasks between 2 and 3. It doesn't matter what order these are done in, so we split the batches 2 to 1, then swap. Do you have a better solution?" No, do that." "Thanks for your advice, Plops." Plops walked away looking very red, with the guys bursting out laughing while still very much in earshot. Plops complained numerous times, and the chief of production told us off in a very half-arsed way. We later found out he also hated Plops for consistently bringing his nickname up and expecting something to be done, often telling him that this wasn't a school and to just play along, it'll naturally go away. Fast forward to one day when Plops was late for a site-wide meeting. He entered the room to be met with 2 or 3 voices chastising him with comments such as, "What time do you call this, Plops?" and "Good grief, it's Plops o'clock." Turning a now familiar shade of crimson, he opened his mouth, but then noticed the director of operations stood at the front, having paused his speech. Plops shut his mouth and quickly found a seat. The director continued for a bit before pausing to ask if anybody had any questions. Plops' hand immediately shot up. Apologies for being late, but I had a question about the half-year business projections. Given the ramp-up in production, was this already covered, or is this a good time to ask the question? This question had absolutely nothing to do with anything we did, and it was painfully obvious Plops was just asking the question to seem even more pretentious than he normally was. The director replied, "Not a problem, Plops, maybe save that one for the end." This was too much for everybody else, who burst out laughing. The director didn't know who Plops was, and had assumed that was his name. The director innocently asked, "Oh, is that not his name?" Someone explained it was a nickname. He was called John. The director apologized to Plops, presumably trying to hide his embarrassment. Said, don't worry, it wasn't an important question." After the meeting, Plops excused himself and we didn't see him for the rest of the day. He was back in the following day with an even more sour face than normal. We were all still giddy about how the director had called him Plops, so we just gave him a wide berth. A few days later, when the atmosphere had calmed down, Plops announced at a meeting that he'd accepted a similar role at another site and would be transferring in the next week. We then found out that Plops had complained yet again about a director no less to the chief, who had now got fed up of having to baby the kid and had a quiet word with the director. Said director, presumably wanting to save face a little, advised that another production lead at a different facility was going on maternity leave, so Plops could be parachuted into that role fairly easily. They then had the best part of a year to find somewhere else for him. We weren't sad to see Plops go, but he forgot to bring in cakes on his last day. So one of the guys who'd worked with some of the staff in the new facility made a phone call. From what I understand, Plops' outgoing counterpart introduced him at one of their morning meetings and invited him to speak. He said, "Good morning, I'm John, and I'll be taking over from Lisa while she's off. I'm an experienced production leader, so I'm hoping we can keep the wheels turning while Lisa and I make the transition. Wishing her the best with the baby and for the new parent life." A chorus of voices came from across the room. "Well said, Plops." We eventually got a new production leader who'd worked in a similar role at another company. He seemed to be a decent guy. At his first meeting, he introduced himself and brought in a crate of homemade samosas. He said he didn't want to intrude on our workstations unnecessarily, and thus asked everybody to pop into his office at some point in the next day or two to introduce themselves and have a 5 to 10 minute chat. I was nominated by the guys to go first and report back how he was. I summarized his personality with one observation before I'd even sat down. I walked over to the office door and knocked. He waved at me to come in, and as my gaze went upwards, I noticed a new sign he'd put on the door: Plops Office. Jumping down to the comments on this one, we have one from a user called Cheese Nuggets 2003. It says, "I've gotta ask, if Plops had brought in cakes, might his nickname have stayed in your facility?" OP responded and said, "The other facility wouldn't have been aware of his nickname, so it certainly wouldn't have followed him there had he brought in cakes. To be honest, we were so glad to be rid of him that cakes would have made us happy and potentially even resulted in a 'best of luck, John' send-off. However, I hear he was just as pompous in the new facility too, so I'm sure they would have come up with something too." I can't count the number of times I've mentioned after a story that management needs to be people who have actually done the job that they are managing. And even if it's an outside hire, they should spend a few weeks doing the jobs of the people they're going to be managing. But that never happens. And then you get people like Plops. Plops, plops, fizz, fizz, what a relief his leaving is. Can we also touch on the fact that OP wanted to explain what Plops was for people who don't speak English, but they used the word onomatopoeic in that sentence? I'm wondering how many people who don't speak English had to look that word up. This story comes to us from Captain Underpants. Politicians ignore warnings about publishing everyone's data online. Back when every business and government was starting to get their services accessible online for the first time, there was a new law passed in my state that all local government public records must be accessible via the web. Those records held by local government included dog registrations, building plans and permits, property ownership information, etc. Until this point, you had to physically turn up at the local government offices and have your name recorded to access such information. But it was free to access, and they were not permitted to deny you. At the time, I was the webmaster for one of the local government areas in Australia. When this was first proposed, we highlighted that residents would be very upset by making this information easier to access, and potentially for people to scrape the entire dataset. Tests to prove you were human were not very reliable back then. This was politics, so we were somewhat surprised that the politicians didn't see the potential public backlash. We also wanted to protect our residents from people who could try to use it for profit or mass access to this information. Our warnings were ignored, so we complied maliciously. I wrote an absolutely brilliant information portal with the best CAPTCHA we could implement at the time, which complied exactly with what the law required. We ensured the local newspaper knew the exact date and time it would go online and what would be published. It was easy to find and put in a lot of time to ensure news media would be able to easily demonstrate the potential harm. The following day, front page news about the massive privacy issues this could pose. That morning, we were told to take it offline, and it stayed offline permanently. The portal was up for a total of 27 hours. In the aftermath, politicians tried to shift the blame to our local government leadership, who shifted it to us in the IT department. We had prepared a paper trail to ensure that those truly responsible were given all the credit for the project, and those who rebuffed our warnings had their emails included in the Freedom of Information requests made during the investigation. I feel like this one could have been taken a step further. On the main page for that portal, there should have been some side link examples, for some of the major politicians in that area, just to show what of their information was available on there. It would give them a good example of what information was available of every person in that portal. We didn't really get any closure information on whether the politicians were investigated for this or not, but, I'm assuming they probably investigated themselves and found they did absolutely nothing wrong. This story comes to us from Viking ZX. Landlord maliciously complianced themselves. This happened a few years ago in my last apartment. My roommate and I were living in a basement place with upstairs neighbors, and the owner decided he wanted to sell. The upstairs neighbors ended up buying it and became our new landlords, and they were awful at it. I could fill a whole post with the amount of stuff they tried to get away with, but we're here to talk about one particular instance. But suffice to say, they had no idea that landlords had responsibilities and simply saw us tenants as a source of income that should be ever growing. Hence our rent suddenly spiking and why we left. But there was one time they maliciously complianced themselves. See, they had a habit of trying to push stuff on us that was blatantly illegal. Their first contract, for example, said among other things that they had the right to enter the apartment at any time they wanted and could go through our stuff if they wished because we were living on their property. I pointed out that this was highly illegal, and they grew very upset, saying, "Well, we'll see about that." This clause later suddenly became the real one before we signed. One day, however, our lone fire alarm stopped working. As dutiful tenants, we reached out and said, "Hey, the fire alarm stopped working." Their response was a predictable sort of, "So what?" "We need to have a working fire alarm," we explained, "and it's the landlord's duty to provide working fire alarms." "No, it's not. You want one? You get it. The law says otherwise." And here's where they maliciously complianced themselves. Possibly because they were getting tired of being corrected, they got snooty with this one. We got a very sarcastic response. "Oh, it does it? Well, we'll just see what the fire marshal has to say about that." Me and my roommate, upon receiving this message, burst out laughing. But they were serious. They thought they were going to contact the fire marshal, he was going to side with them, and then they could come down on us hard. I don't know what their expressions were when we said, "Okay, yeah, do that." However, the next morning, there's frantic knocking at our door. There's the landlord and his family, looking very concerned, with a bag of brand new fire alarms, one for each room, and if I recall correctly, even 2 spares. He begs to be let inside outside of the 24-hour notice and says it's an emergency, He has to put these alarms up right now. Trying not to laugh, we let them in, and they hurriedly put one in every single room, apologizing profusely for the delay, and telling us, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I don't know how that meeting with the fire marshal went, or if they got him or someone else at their office, but their attitude painted a pretty clear picture of the ultimate result. They complied maliciously, thinking they'd called our bluff. Whoops. Jumping down to the comments on this one, we have one from a user called Mr. Spiffenheimer. It says, yeah, the fire marshal does not F around. When he gives you 24 hours to remedy a problem, he's being very generous, and your consequences can be pretty extreme for missing that deadline. Another commenter down below called Wake Island Tango said, fire marshals are only one small step below postal inspectors in terms of creatures you want to avoid at all costs. OP responded and said, that is the bit that makes this so memorable to both me and my buddy. They didn't go, well, we'll check the law ourselves, or say they were going to contact someone else. They went right to the last person you'd want to bug with a question that is, frankly, that dumb. Nuclear option. They just didn't realize they were the ones about to be nuked. If OP really wanted to screw over the landlord in this case, they could have said no to coming in without that 24 hours notice and then called the fire marshal themselves. But that would have definitely been the nuclear option, and it wouldn't have gone well for them with that landlord after that at all. You've got to think in this one though that the landlord really did remedy the situation. They obviously got put in their place by the fire marshal's office because they came right back with a bag of fire detectors and put them up all over OP's apartment. That's actually exactly what OP wanted. Alright, I think we'll end this one here. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us on your preferred podcasting platform. If you're on Spotify, if you could give us a 5-star rating, I would very much so appreciate it. I thank each and every one of you for watching and listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.